And again, thank you for the opportunity to share some of my research and some of my viewpoints with you. It's been very interesting to listen to the talks so far. They've been varied both in their scope and in their attitude towards the topics. They've all brought up very important parts of the discussion that needs to be led on CPEC. Now, in this talk, I will go more into the detail both of my own study and more onto the ground. Because as an anthropologist of Central Asia and Xinjiang, I have done extensive fieldwork, conducted extensive fieldwork in Xinjiang. And on the basis of this, I want to approach the Belt and Road Initiative and CPEC from an on-the-ground perspective. I want to point to some important chances and some important dangers that the initiative entails for local populations along the belt, along the corridor. And in order to do that, because CPEC has quite recently started and there hasn't been a lot of research on the impact on local communities on the ground. Instead, I will look at the area that I've been studying, which is Xinjiang, the eastern part of the CPEC corridor, so to speak, and look at the last 2 decades of Chinese-led development policies in the area to draw some important lessons. Why do I look on the ground? Why don't I look at statistics and big data? Well, statistics are extremely important, and I will have a few of them also on some of my slides. But if we overlook the engagement with the local population, we risk alienating them, and that, as we've heard in some of the other presentations, might lead to severe long-term problems and cause severe security risk by creating a non-sustainable and non-stable development. Basically, I argue that the BRI and CPEC carry great potential to lift local populations out of poverty. That is, if these local populations are integrated into the development schemes to a sufficient degree. And I also argue that based on my own research, talking to people, that is in Xinjiang, but I think this counts as far as I've heard from my colleagues, also for the parts of Pakistan that are involved, especially Gilgit-Baltistan, that might be comparable to Xinjiang in both the kind of problems it has and the role it plays as a border region in the CPEC, that the local population, in the local population, there's both a willingness and a potential for supporting the state-led development along the corridor. Again, as long as they're fairly integrated and they're taken along. If that doesn't happen, then the risk is that these populations end up being even more strongly marginalized than they are already, alienated from the process, and turn to political and religious radicalization. So in this talk, I'll discuss 3 dangers that might lead down that road. And from them, I will derive some sort of recommendation. My basic recommendation is not to jump into fast development, fast growth, fast statistical numbers rising too fast, but rather focus on sustainable growth that takes along the community. I know that this is not what some people hope for in Pakistan. They hope for this to be a fast game changer. But as we've heard in some of the other talks, and I totally agree with that, and this fits with my own research in Xinjiang, focusing too heavily on statistics means prioritizing large corporations over the needs of local people. It leads to fast growth in the statistics, but it also leads to unsustainable development in the local communities that lead to fragmentation, alienation, and security problems, of which there are already more than enough in the region, as we've heard. So the three dangers I see that need to be avoided if the CPEC is going to be successful in Pakistan, and that have not, unfortunately, been avoided in Xinjiang in the last 20 years, are over-securitization, the failure to integrate the local population by giving priority to the interest of large corporations instead of the need of local populations, and third, a move too quickly from informal systems to formal systems. That is, destroying local informal structures before the formal infrastructure is sustainable enough to take over the services needed for the local population in a long-term perspective. So destroying the local structures instead of letting them transform by themselves. These aren't things that necessarily will follow from the CPEC. These mistakes do not have to be made. They are political decisions, and they're not political decisions that need to be implemented by the Chinese. The Chinese have their own economic interests, and they will take care of them. They are choices that need to be made by Pakistani policymakers, and thus choices that need to be made consciously in the Pakistani population through a dialogue about this. Now, how do we gauge the risks involved in CPEC, a project that is still very much in development, even in the planning phase? There's been a lot of talk in relation to the one, whoa, we're far too far ahead, sorry. Let's stop there. There's been a lot of debate, or a lot of mention of the ancient Silk Road in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative, but this only entails abstract parallels to the current situation. Instead, I would like to go back to Xinjiang, the eastern half of the CPEC, in the last 20 years, where China launched the development initiative to develop the Great West, which carries a lot of parallels to what is today done on the Belt and Road, and especially in CPEC. And in a way, we can see CPEC as developing out of Develop the Great West. This was an initiative introduced by the Chinese government to develop the western part of China that was lacking behind, something we've also heard more about earlier today. But it was also a way of giving space to overcapacities and overaccumulation created on the eastern side of China. And there are some interesting parallels between this and the CPEC. In Develop the Great West, Eastern Chinese companies were paired with regions in the West, so they could aid and invest into these regions. Also, a lot of special economic zones were opened, and there was a push for economic development of these regions through Eastern Chinese companies coming in and taking over the building of infrastructure, which is very much the same we see along the Belt and Road. There are also some important differences, but because time is advanced, we won't be able to go into that now. Now, what has happened during these 20 years of development implementation in Xinjiang? One thing, there's been an enormous economic growth, and an enormous, exactly, we see here some of the numbers, and I'm going to go into detail with some of them later. These are later numbers. Enormous economic growth in the statistics. The GDP has risen, more than doubled. And at the same time, there's been rising social tensions, including violence, both by protesters and by the state. CPEC has the potential of both of these. But if implemented the right way, with patience and integration of local population, the second can be avoided. Basically, and I'm going to jump ahead, what happened in Xinjiang during this time was a high rise in per capita income, rise in government and cadre salaries, and until 2014, a strengthening of the local economy, flourishing border trade, a local build-up of tourism and local markets, and an Uyghur middle class that was on the rise very much through trickle-down effects. But a lot of this growth was achieved through Han Chinese companies coming into the region and also through migration of Han Chinese into the region. And the inequalities that this created and the different types of growth on the two sides of the population created social tensions that resulted in a lot of protests which were clamped down upon by the government and reacted upon again by the local population through violent incidences. This led to, in 2014, the declaration of a state of emergency in Xinjiang. And since 2014, if we go back to the statistics, we can see that after 2014, the gross domestic product in Xinjiang stagnated. And seeing it as stagnation in these statistics is in fact means that the local economy collapsed, because at the same time, and we see that number of projects under construction, the construction project are a good indicator of the kind of investment coming in from the central government, there was an enormous push still of investment into the region. So if we don't see the numbers go up very high, it is because the local economy, and especially the economy of local Uyghurs, completely declined after 2014, and that is even though the yearbooks that are accessible online only give the numbers to 2016, that's very much the picture we still find today in 2018 because of the strong securitization of the region. Now, securitization, over-securitization, please go ahead to the next slide, is detrimental for the economy and for business. And that is quite easy to understand. The question is, how do we get to a point where we need this? And for this, I would like to give a few examples. The first one is what I would call the second danger after over-securitization, giving priority to large enterprises, construction companies. This happened in Kashgar for the Special Economic Zone. In Kashgar in 2010, a Special Economic Zone was implemented. A lot of buildings were built, a lot of infrastructure was constructed, a lot of people were moved from the land. But please go ahead. When I visited the place last in 2016, so 6 years after the implementation of the Special Economic Zone, most of these buildings were empty and not utilized. That also goes for some of it was deteriorating. This commercial center had been built 2 years earlier, but it was not in use. The only people I found there were some Pakistani businessmen who used it, peddlers over the border from Gilgit-Baltistan. They used it to stay in because they could get it for free, whereas they would have to pay for a hotel room. But there was no business, no customers going on. The same was the case for the new Shenzhen city, large buildings of an enormous, almost covering a whole new city that was not in use. Now, I was surprised at this because it seemed like this would be waste of money, this would be bad planning. Well, in fact, it was good planning, just not for the local population. It was good planning for the construction companies. They made a lot of money in this time. It was good planning for both Shenzhen and Guangzhou, who profited immensely from this, but it was bad planning for the local population who was left out. Another example is, okay, I think we've gone ahead a bit too far, were the traders going across the border. And here too, local Uyghur traders were involved in border trade into Kyrgyzstan, and I followed them for a while. This border trade, as the infrastructure improved, was changed onto larger companies that were mainly Han Chinese run, and also with the collapse of the ruble and the downturn of the economy in Central Asia, a lot of chances were lost, and people who had gone into this trade lost out, including communities at the border who had been involved in resettlement programs in order to get them into the formal economy and get them out of the areas that they were living in around the border of Kyrgyzstan. Here, and this is my third point, the third danger, so to speak, there were two different types of communities. And the people in each communities coped with this volatility of the market system in very different ways. So basically what happened was, in both communities, the government encouraged people to move into the formal economy out of the informal economy. In one of the communities, people were moved away from their land, and that was the case in Tashkoran, in the villages around the border area. They lost their land, thus they lost the connection to the home village, and they lost their social networks that were upheld and created through the village. In the other case, the traders of Atush, they didn't lose this. What happened was the border trade that had been going well stopped for various reasons that weren't in control of either the traders nor the Chinese government. The financial crisis in the ruble crisis in Russia, and border closings between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan because of violence in Osh. And the communities that had stayed in their own villages and that had upheld their informal social connections, they were able to regroup, they were able to move on into different kind of business, and they lost a lot of money, but they upheld the possibility of participating in the economy. The other group, the one on the border area of Kyrgyzstan that was moved away from their villages into new housing, they also lost their business opportunities when the trade regime changed, but they didn't have anything to go back to, and they ended up having to leave the area as migrant laborers to other parts. A lot of them, I know, were extremely dissatisfied and were moving into radical political and religious ideas and ideologies. So, to conclude, my findings suggest a number of lessons and some very basic urges for the planning of implementation of the CPEC. The first one is to pay less attention to growth statistics. Secondly, to be cautious of the involvement of large corporations, land grabbing and profit flight, and to prioritize the integration of local populations and reforms that allow for a high degree of social networks, a high degree of kept informality in the region, even though it's against the theory or the models of how a modern economy is supposed to be. Areas like Xinjiang, and not just Gilgit-Baltistan, but all of Pakistan, arguably, are on the margins of the capitalist world system. And on the margins of the capitalist world system, development is volatile. It goes up and it goes down. And if people have their recourse to social networks, to a strong community base taken away from them, they won't be able to cope with these ups and downs unless there's a strong social state that makes sure that they are secured and taken care of. And Pakistan does not have that yet. China doesn't have that either in the marginal regions. And therefore, allowing for these local communities to consistently exist and allowing for their social networks to remain strong and not trying to dismantle them as backward or left behind is extremely important to be able to cope with what is definitely going to be a big factor in the CPEC no matter what, which are the ups and downs of the world economy and the world system. The last thing I want to say is I want to reiterate that the populations that I've been working with are all extremely willing to cooperate. They believe in modern and modernist development more than I do. And they are willing to be a substantial supportive part of development schemes like both develop the Great West on the Chinese side, the Belt and Road Initiative, and CPEC in Pakistan, but they have to be taken along. And if they're not taken along, if they're not integrated, they will be alienated and they will become, instead of a resource, a liability. It will turn into a real security problem. And the way to deal with that, we already see now in over-securitization, is extremely expensive. It's not good for the legitimacy of the country or the government, and it is detrimental to people's health and people's well-being on the ground. Thank you very much.